Each year, United Nations peacekeeping forces deployed to conflict zones report encounters with environmental anomalies that military psychologists initially dismiss as combat stress disorder. Yet the sheer consistency of these reports across different units, nationalities, and time periods suggests something far more disturbing lurking beneath official explanations. The phenomenon occurs so frequently in areas of mass atrocity that NATO's Classified Environmental Assessment Division, operating with an annual budget exceeding 40 million euros, has been quietly documenting cases where the landscape itself appears to retain memories of violence committed upon it. The Bosnian War of 1992 to 1995 witnessed approximately 100,000 deaths and the displacement of over 2.2 million people, creating killing fields across the dense forests of central Bosnia, with a combination of ancient woodland, limestone geology rich in mineral absorption, and the systematic execution of thousands created conditions that military scientists still struggle to explain in their sealed reports. For a brief period during the final months before the Dayton Accords in late 1995, a Dutch-led peacekeeping patrol attached to the United Nations Protection Force would encounter something so profoundly unnatural in the Vlasenica forest region that it would result in the immediate reclassification of an entire 40 square kilometer zone as permanently off limits to all military and civilian personnel. But what exactly was the living presence that had absorbed the anguish of massacre victims into the very soil and timber of that cursed woodland? And why did 12 experienced soldiers vanish completely from personnel records? Their families told they had died in a routine vehicle accident that never appeared in any official incident log. The Vlasenica forest region encompasses approximately 380 square kilometers of dense primordial woodland in eastern Bosnia, where Carpathian beech and Bosnian pine forests create canopies so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor even at midday. And the soil composition, unique mixture of limestone bedrock, volcanic ash deposits from ancient eruptions, and organic matter accumulated over millennia, creates an environment that local geologists have described as possessing unusual electromagnetic properties that interfere with compass readings and radio transmissions. The area experiences temperature inversions where cold air becomes trapped beneath the canopy, creating perpetual fog in low-lying areas and a dampness that causes metal to rust within days and leather to develop mold almost overnight, while the region's isolation made it historically ideal for both medieval monasteries seeking solitude and centuries later for military units seeking to hide evidence of atrocities far from international observers. The terrain is dissected by hundreds of unmarked mass graves, some dating back to World War II partisan warfare, others freshly dug during the ethnic cleansing campaigns of the 1990s, creating a landscape where death has literally been layered into the earth across multiple generations. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that such a place, where violence has been systematically committed and concealed for decades, might develop characteristics that transcend rational scientific explanation. Long before the Yugoslav wars brought modern horror to these woods, the forest had accumulated a dark reputation stretching back to medieval chronicles kept by Franciscan monks at the Papratnica monastery, which documented in elaborate Latin texts from 1392 what they called Silva Vivens, the living forest describing how trees in certain groves appeared to move their positions overnight, how the earth itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm like breathing, and how monks who ventured too deep into specific valleys would return speaking in tongues they had never learned, reciting what linguists later identified as fragments of Illyrian, a language dead for over 1,000 years. The Ottoman records from the 16th century contain multiple references to an area they designated as Nefs Ormani, the forest, that breathes, where Janissary units reported that certain groves had to be avoided during night patrols because soldiers would become disoriented hearing voices of their dead comrades emanating from the trees themselves, and in one particularly detailed account from 1537, An entire company of 40 men allegedly walked into a grove at dusk and simply never emerged, their weapons and equipment found scattered across a half-kilometer radius with no bodies ever recovered. During World War II, both partisan and Chetnik forces documented similar phenomena in classified after-action reports, describing how certain sections of the forest seemed to actively resist military operations, with trees falling without wind, roots appearing across paths that had been clear hours before, and a persistent sound like labored breathing that would drive sentries to abandon their posts in terror. Yet both sides continued using the area for executions, precisely because bodies disposed of there were never found again, as if the forest itself consumed all evidence. The United Nations Protection Force had been receiving disturbing reports from the Vlasenica sector since early 1994, with incident logs from French and Canadian units describing equipment malfunctions, unexplained casualties, and psychological breakdowns among personnel assigned to patrol specific grid coordinates. A Canadian reconnaissance team in March 1994 reported that their surveying equipment detected seismic activity consistent with breathing rhythmic expansion and contraction of the Earth, occurring at 14-second intervals across a 3-kilometer zone. Data that was immediately classified, and the team rotated out within 72 hours. French sappers clearing mines in June 1994 documented finding root systems that had grown through and around their marked safe corridors, overnight wrapping around deactivated mines in patterns that appeared almost deliberate. And when they returned to re-clear the same routes, they discovered trees that they had positively marked for removal had somehow moved 15 to 20 meters from their tagged positions. Most disturbing were the audio recordings captured by a Swedish signals intelligence unit in September 1994, which picked up what their report described as vocalization patterns inconsistent with wildlife, wind, or mechanical sources, sounds that phonetic analysis suggested were human voices speaking in Serbian, Croatian, and Bosniak, simultaneously, all repeating the same phrase over and over. Zemlja pamti, the earth remembers. Similar encounters were reported by Danish, Norwegian, and British units throughout 1995, creating a pattern of unexplained phenomena concentrated in areas where mass graves had been established. Yet these reports were consistently dismissed by command staff as stress reactions until the deployment of the Dutch contingent in August 1995 would provide evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. September 28, 1995, at precisely 14:30 hours, Staff Sergeant Willem van der Berk, a 32-year-old Dutch peacekeeper with 11 years of military service, who had earned the call sign, steady for his unshakable composure during the Rotterdam riots of 1990, led a 12-man patrol into Grid Sector Tango 7 Victor, a densely forested valley approximately 8 kilometers southwest of the abandoned village of Kamenika, where intelligence reports suggested the presence of unmarked mass graves that required documentation before the upcoming peace negotiations. The patrol included Corporal Niklas Janssen, a former forestry student nicknamed Timber, who had volunteered for the mission specifically because of his woodland navigation skills, Private First Class Henrik Vogel, the unit's medic known as Patch, who carried trauma kits designed for mass casualty scenarios, and Private Omar Rashid, a Belgian-born signal specialist called Sparks, whose radio equipment represented the patrol's only link to the forward operating base, 23 kilometers north. The temperature that afternoon held steady at 11 degrees Celsius, with oppressive humidity that made their body armor feel like it was suffocating them, and the forest canopy blocked so much sunlight that they were forced to use flashlights. Even though it was mid-afternoon, the beams cutting through fog so thick it seemed to have physical substance that resisted their movement through it. Van der Berk noted in his patrol log at 14:47 hours that the forest was unnaturally silent. No bird calls, no insect sounds, not even the rustle of small mammals, and that the air carried a smell he described as copper, mixed with wet earth and something sweetly rotten like flowers left too long in a vase of stagnant water. It was at 15:12 hours when the patrol reached a clearing marked on their map as the suspected gravesite that Private Rashid's radio emitted a burst of static, and then what he initially thought was interference, but which his training and signals intelligence made him realize was something far more disturbing, a rhythmic pattern occurring at precise 14-second intervals, like a carrier wave modulated by something biological rather than electronic. Within minutes of entering the clearing, every member of the patrol began reporting the same sensation, a pressure against their eardrums that pulsed in rhythm with the radio interference, as if the air itself was expanding and contracting like the interior of massive lungs drawing breath. Corporal Janssen, using his forestry background, immediately noticed that the trees surrounding the clearing were positioned in a pattern that violated every principle of natural growth. They formed a perfect circle, exactly 47 meters in diameter, with their trunks all tilted inward at the same 15-degree angle, and their root systems had broken through the surface soil in ways that created a web-like network pulsing with visible movement, undulating slowly like veins carrying blood beneath translucent skin. The ground itself seemed to rise and fall by approximately 8 centimeters with each 14-second cycle. And when Private Vogel knelt to examine the soil, he discovered it was warm to the touch, measuring 31 degrees Celsius on his medical thermometer, despite the ambient air temperature being only 11 degrees, and had a texture that he described in his later testimony as less like dirt and more like tissue, almost muscular in its density and moisture content. The trees began exhibiting phenomena that Van der Berg's patrol log described in increasingly frantic terms. The bark was weeping a substance that resembled sap, but had the viscosity and color of human blood, running down the trunks in streams that pooled at the base before being absorbed back into the root systems. And when Corporal Janssen collected a sample in a plastic evidence bag, the liquid was still warm and contained cellular structures that under his field microscope appeared disturbingly similar to red blood cells. The smell intensified dramatically, that copper-earth rot combination now mixed with something that Private Rashid identified as resembling burned hair and ozone, the same smell that accompanies electrical transformers when they overload. And every electronic device in the patrol began malfunctioning simultaneously. Watches stopped at exactly 15:18 hours. GPS units displayed coordinates that placed them 340 kilometers away in the Adriatic Sea, and night vision equipment showed the forest glowing with heat signatures that formed patterns resembling a massive circulatory system spreading through the earth beneath their feet. At 15:27 hours, Private First Class Henrik Vogel made the fatal mistake of approaching one of the larger trees to collect a bark sample, and the moment his gloved hand made contact with the trunk, the root system beneath his feet erupted upward with such violence that it lifted him a full meter off the ground before wrapping around both legs with a grip that his screaming described as crushing, like a hydraulic press. "I can feel my bones bending." Van der Berg and 3 other soldiers immediately moved to pull him free, hacking at the roots with their combat knives and entrenching tools. But the organic material had a tensile strength that exceeded anything they had encountered, their blades barely scoring the surface, and with each 14-second pulse of the breathing cycle, the roots constricted tighter, pulling Vogel inexorably downward into soil that had somehow liquefied into a consistency resembling wet concrete. The medic's screams became something beyond human as the roots began to branch and spread beneath his uniform, and through the torn fabric, the patrol could see wooden tendrils literally penetrating his flesh, burrowing beneath the skin like parasitic worms, creating raised tracks across his abdomen and chest that pulsed in rhythm with the forest's breathing. Corporal Janssen, in his desperation, fired his Damaco C7 rifle directly into the root mass, but the 5.56 millimeters rounds simply embedded themselves in the wood without severing anything, and the muzzle flash seemed to agitate the entire clearing, Every tree simultaneously released a sound that Van der Berg's report described as an exhalation, a sigh of satisfaction, as if the forest was pleased by the violence being committed. Within 90 seconds of initial contact, Henrik Vogel had been pulled completely beneath the surface, his final visible moment. Being his right hand, reaching upward through the soil, fingers spread before the earth closed over it like a mouth swallowing its final bite. The patrol frantically dug at the spot where he had vanished, but found only normal forest soil. No body, no equipment. No trace that a human being had just been consumed, except for a spreading wet stain in the earth that was unmistakably blood. And in the sudden terrible silence that followed, every soldier simultaneously heard something that would haunt their remaining days. Vogel's voice, distant but distinct, coming not from the ground, but from the trees themselves, speaking in a language none of them understood, but which carried the unmistakable tone of someone begging for mercy that would never come. Staff Sergeant Van der Berg immediately attempted to establish communications with the forward operating base, but Private Rashid's radio equipment produced only that same rhythmic static pulsing at 14-second intervals. And when Rashid switched through all available frequencies, military, civilian, even emergency bands, every single channel carried the same biological breathing pattern, as if something was actively jamming their transmissions, not with electronic warfare, but with a living signal that overwhelmed all other communications. Van der Berg made the command decision to abort the patrol and exfiltrate immediately, establishing a defensive perimeter around the clearing's edge while he organized the withdrawal. But Corporal Jansen's compass spun wildly without settling on any consistent bearing, and the GPS units continued displaying impossible coordinates that changed with each reading, placing them variously in Croatia, Hungary, and at one point showing their position as 3,400 meters beneath sea level. The patrol's map specialist, Private Leon Backer, a geography student nicknamed Atlas, who had navigated the unit flawlessly for 6 months, attempted to use terrain association and dead reckoning to plot their route out, but discovered something that violated every principle of topography he had ever learned. The ridgeline they had descended 2 hours earlier was no longer visible in any direction, and the valleys that should have provided egress routes had somehow closed the terrain, having reconfigured itself into a bowl-shaped depression with the clearing at its center and forest walls, rising steeply in every direction, regardless of which compass bearing they faced. Private Thomas DeWitt, a former engineering student called Gears, who carried the patrol's surveying equipment, used his laser rangefinder to measure distances to specific trees, recorded the readings in his eyes. Notebook then measured again, 15 minutes later, to discover that the same trees were now 8 to 12 meters closer than his initial readings. And when he pointed this out to Van der Berg, the staff sergeant made him repeat the measurements 3 times before accepting the impossible conclusion that the forest was literally contracting around them, the breathing cycle, not just vertical, but horizontal. The entire woodland shrinking inward with each 14-second pulse, like a pupil constricting in response to light. While establishing their defensive position, Private Rashid discovered something protruding from the base of one of the bleeding trees, a water-damaged leather satchel that contained documents he immediately recognized as military field journals based on their standardized format, though the writing was in Serbian Cyrillic script that required translation assistance from Private Dusan Kovac, a Serbian-speaking intelligence liaison nicknamed Bridge, who had been assigned to the Dutch unit specifically to facilitate communication with local populations. Kovac's face went pale as he translated pages dated from August 1992, written by a Bosnian Serb army lieutenant named Radovan Lukic, who had commanded an execution squad in this exact location. And the journal described in clinical detail how 347 Bosniak civilians had been systematically shot and buried in the clearing over a 3-day period. But more disturbing were the final entries from the 4th day, when Lukic documented that his men began reporting that the bodies they had buried were somehow moving beneath the soil. that they could hear voices coming from the graves, despite having personally confirmed every victim was dead, and that the trees surrounding the clearing had developed a coating of red sap that his men believed was blood. The lieutenant's handwriting deteriorated across subsequent pages, becoming frantic and illegible in places, describing how roots had emerged from the mass grave during the night and dragged two of his own soldiers underground while they slept, how the forest had begun breathing in a rhythm that matched human respiration, and how the trees were whispering in the voices of the executed civilians, speaking what Lukic identified as Stara Molitva, the old prayer, a pre-Christian Slavic invocation that his grandmother had warned him was forbidden because it called upon the earth itself to witness and remember blood oaths and unavenged deaths. The journal's final entry, dated August 19, 1992, consisted of a single sentence repeated 37 times in increasingly erratic handwriting. Zemlya Ag Primula, Inis e Pestiti. The earth has accepted them and will not let them go. Kovac also translated fragments of what appeared to be medieval text, copied onto the journal's back pages, identifying it as a warning from the Papratnica Monastery archives, describing how the soil of this valley has drunk the blood of innocents across centuries, and has developed a memoria terrae, a memory of the earth that transforms botanical matter into a living archive of suffering, where roots become veins, sap becomes blood, and the forest itself becomes a singular organism animated by the collected anguish of all who died unavenged upon this ground. At 17:23 hours, as daylight began to fail, and Van der Berg was finalizing plans for a night movement, despite the navigation impossibilities, the breathing cycle suddenly accelerated from 14-second intervals to 7-second intervals, the pulsing of the ground becoming so violent that it knocked 3 soldiers off their feet, and the trees began moving in ways that shattered any pretense of natural phenomena, trunks actually bending at their centers, like joints articulating, branches reaching downward with motions that appeared deliberately grasping, and root systems breaking through the surface in waves that traveled across the forest floor like muscular contractions beneath skin. Private Backer screamed a warning as one of the larger trees actually uprooted itself and moved approximately 4 meters closer to their defensive position with a locomotion that resembled a spider using its roots as legs, the entire mass of timber and earth shifting with a wet sucking sound and leaving behind a crater that immediately filled with that warm blood-like substance. Corporal Janssen, remembering his forestry training about how fire was the traditional tool for clearing deadwood, made the desperate decision to deploy white phosphorus grenades from their combat load. And when the incendiary devices detonated among the closest trees, the effect was immediate and horrifying. The trees released a sound that every soldier later described identically as screaming, distinctly human screaming, dozens of voices crying out simultaneously in agony, and the blood sap erupted from every trunk like arterial spray, but the fire itself seemed unable to catch properly, the flames guttering and dying, as if the moisture content of the wood was too high despite the phosphorus, burning at 300 degrees Celsius. The temporary respite provided by the incendiary attack lasted only until 17:31 hours, when the breathing cycle slowed back to its original 14-second rhythm, and the forest seemed to exhale a visible fog from the scorched trees, thick greenish mist that smelled of chlorophyll and copper and carried voices within it, dozens of distinct speakers all whispering in a polyglot mixture of Serbian, Croatian, and Bosniak and private. Kovac identified fragments of what they were saying, names of the dead from the 1992 massacre, asking why no one had avenged them, demanding to know why their killers had never been punished, and promising that the forest remembers what men forget, and the earth will have its justice, even if heaven remains silent. At 18:47 hours, as full darkness descended, and the patrol's flashlights created isolated pools of illumination in an ocean of absolute blackness, the breathing cycle underwent a catastrophic transformation. The 14-second intervals collapsed into a continuous rhythmic pulsation that made the ground undulate like the surface of a storm-tossed sea, rising and falling in waves that traveled across the forest floor with increasing amplitude. And what had been a single clearing surrounded by forest now revealed itself as merely the visible portion of something vastly larger, as the trees in every direction began exhibiting the same bleeding phenomenon simultaneously, creating the unmistakable impression that the patrol was standing not in a forest, but inside a single massive organism whose circulatory system had just been fully activated. The temperature dropped precipitously from 11 degrees to -4 degrees Celsius in less than 3 minutes, their breath condensing into fog that hung motionless in the air rather than dissipating. And Private Rashid's malfunctioning radio suddenly began receiving clear transmissions, but not from their forward operating base or any known frequency, instead broadcasting voices speaking in languages that Kovac identified as medieval Serbian dialects that had been dead for 6 centuries, mixed with what sounded like Latin liturgical chants and fragments of something far older that matched no known linguistic pattern. The sky above the canopy, visible through gaps in the branches, began displaying phenomena that shattered every principle of meteorology and physics. The clouds were moving in geometric patterns, forming and reforming into shapes that resembled anatomical diagrams of lungs and hearts, while the stars themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the forest's breathing. And Private DeWitt, using his engineering background to calculate what he was observing, realized with mounting horror that the stellar pulsation was impossible unless the stars themselves were moving, or unless the fabric of space above them was expanding and contracting like a membrane being rhythmically stretched. The bleeding trees had multiplied exponentially, and now every trunk within their line of sight wept that crimson sap blood in quantities that should have drained them dry within minutes. Yet the flow continued unabated, pooling around root systems that had broken the surface everywhere and formed a network so dense it resembled exposed musculature, each root bundle contracting and expanding with visible peristaltic motion that pumped the blood substance to the system like a heart, distributing vitality through arteries. And Van der Berg's tactical instincts screamed at him that they were no longer standing in a location, but had somehow become embedded within a living entity of incomprehensible scale. Private Leon Backer was the first to break completely, dropping his rifle and tearing at his uniform, while screaming that he could feel roots growing inside his body, burrowing through his intestines. And though the patrol medic, now their sole remaining medical specialist after Vogel's consumption, found no physical evidence of penetration, Backer's abdomen was distended and moving with visible lumps that traveled beneath his skin in patterns that matched the root movements around them. And when Private DeWitt attempted to restrain him, Backer vomited a stream of dark soil mixed with fragments of what appeared to be plant matter and small white objects that Corporal Janssen identified with sick certainty as human teeth. Private Thomas DeWitt began laughing uncontrollably, his engineering mind unable to process the violation of natural laws surrounding them, pointing his laser rangefinder at trees and reading measurements aloud in a sing-song voice. 37 meters, 22 meters, 15 meters. They're getting closer. They're always getting closer, but we're not moving, so how can they be closer? Before his laughter transformed into sobbing, and he curled into a fetal position, muttering calculations about impossible geometry and non-Euclidean forest topology. Corporal Nicholas Johnson, whose forestry expertise had made him the unit's woodland navigation specialist, stood perfectly still, staring at his hands, while tears ran down his face, whispering that he could understand what the trees were saying, now that they were showing him memories absorbed from the soil. He described in precise detail the faces of the 347 civilians executed in 1992, could recite their names, though he had never seen any official casualty list, and began speaking in the voice of a 7-year-old girl named Amira Hezanovi, who had been the youngest victim, begging in Bosniak for her mother, while Janssen's own vocal cords produced sounds his throat should not have been anatomically capable of making. Private Dusan Kovac, the Serbian interpreter, fell to his knees, praying in a mixture of Orthodox liturgy and pre-Christian Slavic invocations that he claimed his great-grandmother had taught him, creating a circle of salt from his ration pack around his position while chanting, Zemlya prosti kriv ni zabravlai, Earth forgive, blood does not forget. His eyes rolled back to show only whites, while his body swayed in rhythm with the forest as breathing. The electronic equipment had transcended mere malfunction and was now behaving with apparent sentience. Private Rashid's radio cycled through frequencies on its own, pausing on each one, just long enough to broadcast a name of someone killed in the massacre, before moving to the next frequency and the next name working through what must have been the complete casualty list, while Rashid sat frozen staring at the device, as if it had transformed into a venomous serpent. Staff Sergeant van der Berk himself felt his command presence crumbling as he realized that the blood pooling around his boots was warm and flowing uphill against gravity, defying physics to spiral around his legs in patterns that resembled Seeking fingers. And when he looked up at the trees surrounding their position, he saw faces formed in the bark-knot abstract pareidolia, but clearly defined human features emerging from the wood grain, hundreds of them, all with their mouths open in silent screams or whispered accusations. And he recognized with absolute certainty that these were not random patterns, but actual impressions of the dead, their final expressions preserved in the timber like death masks cast in organic matter. At 1923 hours, the forest executed what could only be described as a coordinated assault. Every tree within a 50-meter radius simultaneously moved inward, their root systems erupting from the ground in a wave that traveled toward the patrolless position with the speed and violence of a tsunami, while the branches above wove together to form a dome that sealed out the sky and created a chamber lit only by the bioluminescent glow of the blood sap that now coated every surface in pulsing veins of crimson light. Van der Berk ordered his remaining mobile soldiers to fire their weapons, and the combined discharge of 6 Dimako C7 rifles on full automatic should have shredded the advancing timber. But the 5.56 millimeters rounds simply embedded themselves in the wood without slowing the advance, and worse, each impact point erupted with that blood sap in arterial spurts that sprayed across the soldiers and burned their exposed skin like acid-raising blisters that formed patterns resembling Cyrillic script that Kovac identified as spelling the names of massacre victims. The ground beneath their feet liquefied completely, transforming from soil into a viscous organic soup that rose to ankle depth and began pulling them downward with inexorable suction. And Private Backer, still screaming about roots inside his body, sank to his waist before anyone could reach him, his uniform splitting open as actual wooden tendrils erupted from his torso, growing out of his flesh like time-lapse footage of germinating seeds, branching and leafing while he still lived and shrieked. The breathing rhythm accelerated to a panting pace, 3 breaths per second, and with each exhalation, the trees released more of that greenish fog that carried voices now loud enough to understand clearly, 347 distinct speakers all talking simultaneously, describing their deaths, naming their killers, demanding justice, promising that the forest feeds on blood and grows strong on unavenged suffering, and you who walk upon ground watered by our dying will join us in the wood, your bodies becoming roots, your voices becoming whispers, your memories feeding the eternal witness of the earth. Private Rashid Z radio erupted with a sound so loud it shattered the speaker cone. The voice of Lieutenant Radovan Lukic from 1992, screaming about roots pulling him down, begging for mercy in Serbian, while his words were cut off by a wet choking sound, followed immediately by hundreds of voices laughing, not human laughter, but something that used human vocal cords to produce sounds of vindictive satisfaction. The root systems had now formed a complete encirclement with no gaps, weaving together into a living wall 3 meters high that pulsed with that circulatory motion. And Van der Berk realized with the clarity of absolute despair that they had not been walking through a forest for the past 6 hours. They had been walking deeper into the digestive system of something that had been patiently drawing them toward its center. And now that they had reached the point of no return, The organism was preparing to absorb them completely, just as it had absorbed Henrik Vogel, just as it had absorbed Lieutenant Lukik and his execution squad 3 years earlier, just as it had been absorbing victims for centuries, while growing stronger with each addition to its collected mass of traumatized organic memory. At 1931 hours, when the route wall had closed to within 4 meters of the patrol's position, and Private Bakker had been completely subsumed into the organic mass, with only his screaming face still visible protruding from a trunk that pulsed with his fading heartbeat. Salvation arrived in the form that no one had anticipated: a massive artillery barrage from the forward operating base 23 kilometers north, 6 M109 155mm howitzers firing in rapid succession, though later investigation would reveal that no fire mission had been officially ordered, and the gun crews themselves reported acting on instinct after losing radio contact with the patrol, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to fire on specific coordinates that appeared in their minds with crystalline clarity. The first shells impacted at 1932 hours with devastating precision, high explosive rounds detonating in a perfect circular pattern around the clearing's perimeter, and the effect on the forest was immediate and catastrophic. The trees released a sound that shattered every remaining piece of electronic equipment, a shriek of such pure agony that it ruptured eardrums and caused 3 soldiers to vomit blood from the acoustic trauma, and the blood sap erupted from every trunk simultaneously in geyser-like fountains that sprayed 15 meters into the air before raining down in a crimson deluge. The breathing rhythm that had dominated the environment for hours stuttered, became a rhythmic accelerated into hyperventilation, and then suddenly stopped completely. And in the terrible silence that followed the bombardment, the root systems withdrew with violent spasming motions, retracting back into the earth and releasing their grip on the liquefied soil, which solidified almost instantly back into normal forest floor. Staff Sergeant van der Berk, his hearing reduced to a high-pitched ringing and blood streaming from his nose and ears, managed to rally his remaining conscious soldiers. Corporal Janssen, who was still speaking in that child's voice, but could follow basic commands. Private DeWitt, who had stopped laughing and now stared catatonically at nothing. Private Rashid, clutching his destroyed radio like a talisman. Private Kovac, still muttering prayers in dead languages. And 3 other soldiers, who had somehow maintained enough cognitive function to move under their own power. They discovered that the terrain had reverted to normal topography. The ridgeline they had descended that morning was once again visible in the correct direction, and Janssen's compass, though its glass face was cracked, now pointed steadily north. The withdrawal took 43 minutes of stumbling through darkness, and behind them they could hear the forest resuming its breathing, but slower now wounded, a 13-second cycle instead of 14. And mixed with the exhalation came sounds of something massive retreating deeper into the woodland, not defeated, but merely repelled, withdrawing, to heal and wait for the next opportunity to feed on those who walked upon its blood-soaked ground. The patrol emerged from the tree line at 2019 hours and were immediately surrounded by a security cordon that had been established by elements of the British Special Air Service, who had arrived by helicopter within 15 minutes of the artillery. Barrage, though official records would show no SAS presence in the sector that day, and the soldiers were separated from each other before they could compare accounts or discuss what they had witnessed. A Dutch colonel named Peter Hendrik van der Meer, whose name appears on no official United Nations roster and whose existence cannot be verified through any military database, arrived at the forward operating base within 2 hours and personally interviewed each survivor in isolation, his questions suggesting he already knew in precise detail what they had encountered and was merely confirming data points against some pre-existing classification system. By 0300 hours on September 29th, NATO aircraft had conducted a series of airstrikes on the Vlasenica forest sector using a combination of incendiary and thermobaric weapons that created a firestorm visible from 50 kilometers away. and satellite imagery from the following morning showed a scorched zone approximately 12 kilometers in diameter where the forest had been, completely incinerated, though local fire departments reported receiving no calls about the blaze, and civilian witnesses described the flames as burning green and producing no smoke. The bodies of Private Henrik Vogel and Private Leon Backer were never recovered, and official casualty reports listed them as killed in action during routine patrol remains unrecoverable due to hostile action, while their families were told they had died instantly when their vehicle struck a landmine, though the patrol had been entirely on foot and no vehicle was ever involved. Staff Sergeant Willem van der Berg was medically discharged within 60 days with a diagnosis of severe post-traumatic stress disorder with psychotic features and confined to a psychiatric facility in Utrecht, where he remains to this day, still speaking about trees that breathe and soil that remembers his testimony dismissed as the delusions of a broken mind. The remaining survivors were scattered across different units in different countries. Corporal Nicholas Janssen was transferred to a weather station in northern Greenland, where he would have no contact with forests. Private Omar Rashid was reassigned to a signals intelligence post in the Negev Desert. Private Dusan Kavak simply vanished from all personnel records, with rumors suggesting he had been returned to Serbia under circumstances never officially explained, and the others found themselves isolated in postings so remote and obscure that communication between them became impossible. Yet in the final moments before the patrol left the forest's edge, Van der Berg looked back and saw something that would provide him with nightmares for decades. The scorched zone where the artillery had struck was already showing signs of regrowth, small green shoots emerging from the ash-covered soil, and in the darkness between the surviving trees, he could see dozens of faces formed in the bark, all watching the departing soldiers with expressions that conveyed not fear or defeat, but patient, immortal hunger. And he understood with terrible certainty that the forest had not been destroyed, merely pruned, and that it would grow back stronger, fed by the blood already in its roots and waiting for the next group of victims, foolish enough to walk upon ground where 347 souls had been murdered, and the earth itself had sworn to remember their anguish forever. The official United Nations After Action Report for September 28, 1995, consists of exactly 3 sentences, describing a routine patrol that encountered no hostile contact and returned to base, without incident, signed by officers whose names match no personnel in the Upper 4 database and filed in archives that require security clearances so elevated that fewer than 20 people in NATO command structure have access to them. Staff Sergeant Willem van der Berg once described in his performance reviews as possessing exceptional leadership qualities and unshakable psychological resilience, spent the remainder of his life in the Psychiatric Institute of Utrecht, where his medical files document a consistent narrative about forests that breathe and trees that consume soldiers. Testimony that his doctors interpreted as elaborate, trauma-induced delusion, but which remained remarkably consistent across thousands of hours of interviews, never wavering in detail or contradicting itself, even under sodium pentothal interrogation that was administered under circumstances never explained in his medical records. Corporal Nicholas Janssen served 18 months at the Thule Air Base weather station in Greenland, where his duty logs show he performed his meteorological observations with mechanical precision, but never spoke more than absolutely necessary. And in March 1997, he walked out into a blizzard during his off-duty hours and was found frozen to death 11 kilometers from the base, his body positioned in a kneeling posture with his hands clasped in prayer, and his final words written in the snow using his own blood: Zemlya Pamti, the earth remembers. Private Omar Rashid completed his reassignment to the Negev Desert Signals Intelligence Post, but exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, reporting that his radio equipment continued receiving transmissions in medieval Serbian despite being thousands of kilometers from the Balkans, and in June 1998, he suffered what official reports called a psychotic break, during which he destroyed $10 million worth of communications equipment, while screaming that he could hear 347 voices calling his name. And he was subsequently transferred to a secure psychiatric facility in Belgium, where he remains under constant observation. His case files marked with classifications that prevent civilian doctors from accessing his treatment history. Private Thomas DeWitt returned to civilian life and attempted to complete his engineering degree at Delft University of Technology. But his professors noted that his once brilliant mathematical mind had become obsessed with impossible geometries and non-Euclidean topology, filling notebooks with calculations, proving that forests could exist in more than 3 spatial dimensions. And in August 2001, he disappeared while hiking alone in the Black Forest of Germany. His backpack and identification found at a trailhead, but no trace of his body ever discovered despite extensive search operations. That noted unusual root growth patterns in the area where his belongings were recovered. Private Dusan Kovac's fate remains the most mysterious of all survivors official. Records show he was discharged from UN service in October 1995 and returned to Serbia, but Serbian military archives contain no record of his existence. His family claims never to have had a son by that name, and the address listed in his personnel file corresponds to a location in Belgrade that was demolished in 1987, 8 years before he allegedly served in Bosnia, suggesting that his entire identity may have been a fabrication created for purposes that remain classified at levels beyond normal military intelligence protocols. The Vlasenica Forest Sector remains officially designated as Grid Zone Tango 7 Victor Restricted, a classification that appears in no public database, but which every NATO military unit operating in the Balkans receives as part of their operational briefing, with explicit instructions that the area is to be avoided under all circumstances, with no explanation provided for the restriction. And satellite surveillance of the region shows dense forest coverage that has completely regenerated since the 1995 incendiary bombardment, growing back with unnatural speed that forestry experts cannot explain. Without invoking classified data, they are forbidden to discuss. Local Bosnian civilians have their own explanations, passed down through whispered conversations and warnings given to children. They call it Zuma Koja dies, the forest that breathes, and they speak of how the trees remember every drop of blood spilled upon their roots across centuries. Of warfare, how the soil has become a living archive of suffering that transforms botanical matter into something that transcends the boundary between plant and consciousness. And they warn that those who walk too deep into certain groves at certain times will hear voices speaking in languages both familiar and impossibly ancient, calling out names of the dead and promising that the earth never forgets what heaven chooses to ignore. The 347 civilians executed in that clearing in August 1992 were never officially acknowledged by any war crimes tribunal. Their bodies never recovered, their names never added to any memorial, and their families received no closure or justice, but the forest remembers them in ways that international courts and military tribunals never could. Having absorbed their final moments into roots in bark and soil in a form of organic memory that will persist as long as trees continue to grow upon ground watered by unavenged blood. Intelligence analysts studying long-term patterns of unexplained military incidents have identified 17 other forest locations across the former Yugoslavia, 3 in Cambodia, 5 in Vietnam, 2 in Rwanda, and 8 scattered across other conflict zones where mass atrocities occurred in wooded terrain, all exhibiting similar characteristics: seismic activity consistent with breathing patterns, root growth that defies botanical principles, and persistent reports of electronic equipment failures and psychological breakdowns among personnel assigned to patrol these areas, suggesting that what happened to Van der Berg's patrol was not an isolated incident, but rather one manifestation of a global phenomenon that occurs wherever enough blood has been spilled upon forest soil to wake something in the earth that should have remained dormant. The classified documents recovered from Lieutenant Radovan Lukic S leather satchel now stored in a vault beneath. NATO headquarters in Brussels that officially does not exist contain his final. JOURNAL, entry expanded upon in a longer passage that military linguists have struggled to translate because it incorporates vocabulary from dead languages that appear to have no modern equivalent. But the general meaning has been interpreted as a warning that resonates across time. We thought we were disposing of evidence, but we were feeding something far older than our war, something that has been waiting beneath the roots since the first blood was shed upon this ground by peoples whose names are forgotten. And it has grown strong on centuries of suffering, and it will continue to grow until the earth itself reclaims everything built upon, lands where justice was denied and remembrance was forbidden. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.